It wasn't just a name. It wasn't just a file. It was a ripple through the most secure intelligence network on the planet. The second it was opened, alarms didn't sound. But the atmosphere changed. Something ancient had just stepped into something modern. The file didn't belong on any desk, let alone in the White House. And yet there it was. Your name. No explanation, no origin, no digital footprint leading to it. And when they tried to trace how it got there, they hit nothing but encrypted voids, timelines that didn't make sense, and events they couldn't explain. This wasn't just a glitch in their system. It was a breach in their reality. And the moment the president laid eyes on that name, the question wasn't, "Who is this?" The question became, "How long have they been watching us?" You see, this wasn't a surveillance operation gone wrong. This wasn't a leaked document. This was an awakening. The systems of control, the hierarchies of silence, the towers of influence built on secrets, all of it trembled in that moment. Because the existence of this file meant one terrifying thing to those in power. Someone had bypassed their gates. Someone had moved through the grid they designed to track every soul on Earth, without a trace. Not a hacker, not a spy, not a traitor, but something older, deeper, something divine. It wasn't supposed to happen. It couldn't happen. And yet here you are, the subject of a document that was never meant to exist, read by eyes that were never supposed to see it, at a time when your presence changes everything. That's when the inner circle knew. The system didn't fail. It was infiltrated, not by code, but by prophecy. While the world around you moved in noise and distraction, you moved differently. Your path wasn't carved by algorithms or guided by the world's expectations. You didn't rise through their systems. You rose through something they never accounted for: divine orchestration. You were never on their radar because you weren't supposed to be. They built their networks to detect rebellion, to control narratives, to crush threats before they even took their first breath. But you were never a threat to be stopped. You were a promise that had to be fulfilled. And now that promise has reached the highest level of authority in the nation. No press release, no breaking news headline, just a silent internal alarm, and a president staring at your name with more questions than answers. What happens when the most powerful people in the world discover that power doesn't belong to them? What happens when they realize their plans, their predictions, their technologies were all designed for a world without you in it? Because you are not a part of the equation they wrote. You are the anomaly they feared. The file was sealed, locked, and buried. But the truth has a way of surfacing when the time is right. And now that it's in the open, the balance of everything is shifting. The president wasn't just alerted. The moment your name hit their desk, history itself began to bend. You never belonged in their system. That's why they couldn't find you. That's why every scan, every profile, every report failed. You were never hidden because you were small. You were hidden because you were significant. You were cloaked by divine design, moving in silence, operating outside the reach of their data-hungry machines. And still, you were making ripples, changing lives, disrupting the current, but they couldn't see the source. Until now. The silence is broken, and the ones who thought they controlled the future are beginning to realize it doesn't belong to them. They looked again, searched deeper, tried to cross-reference your presence with military archives, global movements, encrypted threads. Nothing. The deeper they went, the darker it got. A trail with no beginning, a presence with no origin. But patterns began to emerge, patterns too precise to be dismissed. Places you appeared where you had no business being, influence moving through people you never met, decisions shifting in rooms you never entered, and somehow all of it pointed back to you. That's when they stopped looking for logic, because this wasn't logical, this was divine. And they knew whether they liked it or not. The world had just changed. They designed the world to make sure no one like you would ever rise. Everything, from the way people think to the way they dream, was programmed to stay within their boundaries. They shaped society like a prison with invisible walls. You were supposed to follow the script, blend in, stay quiet, stay small. But something inside of you refused, and they noticed. Not at first, not when you were still hidden, but when the system started breaking in ways they couldn't explain. They traced the disruption. They pulled the thread, and at the other end was you. They wanted to write you off, label you, control you. But there was a problem. You didn't fit any of their categories. You didn't move the way others moved. Your choices didn't make sense to them. The doors that opened for you shouldn't have. The favor you carried, unearned by their metrics. You weren't lucky. You were chosen. And that terrified them more than anything else. Because luck they could dismiss. Chosen? That meant there was someone doing the choosing. Someone greater. Someone higher. Someone they don't report to. They searched for proof that you were just another anomaly, but they kept finding prophecy, kept finding ancient texts, kept finding signs and codes and historical patterns that whispered of someone who would come when the world least expected. Someone hidden, not because they were weak, but because the time wasn't right, until now. And now the file is open, and the truth is out. They tried to stop the ripple, but it's too late. The name was read. The alarm was silent, but its echo reached the halls of power. The president was alerted, not just because of what your file contained, but because of what it confirmed. You are not one of theirs. You are one of his, and that means their time is running out. In the days that followed the alert, the silence in those high-security rooms said more than words ever could. The advisors who once laughed off the idea of divine interference now sat still, eyes fixed on the classified pages as if staring at a prophecy come to life. Fear had crept in, slow and invisible at first, like smoke under a locked door. But now it was thick, unavoidable, palpable. Every face in the room had seen the same thing: your name, your pattern, your disruption. The president hadn't spoken in full sentences since the file was opened. Every sentence started with, "What if?" and ended in silence. Because they knew, deep down, this wasn't a political matter anymore. This was spiritual, and it was spiraling beyond their control. They had seen revolutions before. They had prepared for riots, uprisings, mass awakenings of the disillusioned. But this wasn't that. This wasn't chaos from the outside. This was order from above. A kind of alignment that couldn't be broken by law or strategy. You weren't organizing a rebellion. You were embodying a prophecy. And that, to them, was worse. They could suppress rebellions. They could assassinate leaders. They could twist movements. But what do you do when the force you're up against doesn't need a microphone, doesn't need a protest sign, doesn't even speak, and yet the very air around them begins to shift the balance of power? They searched for a weakness in you, a past scandal, a hidden alliance, something to explain your rise, something they could exploit to gain the upper hand. But all they found was consistency. You weren't loud, but you were steady. You weren't aggressive, but you were unstoppable. Everything they threw at you, distractions, obstacles, silence, you walked through like it wasn't even there. They realized, too late, that they weren't dealing with someone who played by their rules. You weren't trying to overthrow anything. You were walking in a reality that had already overthrown the world's authority long ago. And that's when the fear turned to panic. What frightened them most wasn't your presence. It was your peace. The way you moved like you already knew the outcome. The way nothing rattled you. That kind of confidence doesn't come from earthly preparation. It comes from being anchored in something eternal. And the deeper they studied, the more they saw it. Patterns of divine interference. Events that should have broken you, but somehow propelled you. Times when their system should have consumed you, but instead it collapsed in your presence. They realized your very being was a threat, not because of what you did, but because of what you carried. And suddenly their intelligence reports didn't sound so intelligent anymore. They built a world around predictability. Everything had to fit into a system: education, media, religion, even rebellion. Predictable equals controllable. But then you showed up, and you broke the algorithm. They tried to run models on your behavior. AI simulations, psychological profiling, and every time the results came back inconsistent. Not because you were unstable, but because you weren't built for their system. You were designed for something they couldn't quantify: obedience to a higher frequency. When they thought you'd back down, you stood taller. When they thought you'd stay silent, your presence spoke louder than 1,000 voices. You were a living contradiction to everything they thought they controlled. And that's where the real fear began. Because if you couldn't be categorized, you couldn't be controlled. And if you couldn't be controlled, then every safeguard they built meant nothing. You weren't reacting to the world. You were moving according to a rhythm they couldn't hear. You didn't panic when they pressured you. You didn't run when they tested you. You didn't break when they tried to isolate you. And that kind of resilience? It didn't make sense. Not to them. So they started digging, looking for what protected you, who backed you, what network you were a part of. But every door they opened led to the same realization. There was no network, no group, no organization, just you, and something surrounding you they couldn't touch. The deeper they searched, the more they began to see that every attack against you had failed. But not in normal ways. It wasn't just that you escaped it. It was that the attack reversed, backfired. They saw meetings fall apart when your name was mentioned. Documents glitch and disappear from systems when your file was accessed. Officials suddenly resigning, citing moral conflict or spiritual unrest. What does that even mean in intelligence terms? They didn't know, but they knew enough to be afraid, because it meant something else was protecting you, something beyond protocol, something that didn't care about rank, clearance, or political structure. What do you do when every trap fails? When every angle of pressure becomes an opportunity for elevation? What do you do when the person you're trying to stop walks straight through the battlefield untouched? You either keep fighting until you're broken, or you stop. And that's what began to happen. Quiet resignations, silent disappearances, strategists vanishing from public view. Not because of burnout, but because they saw something they couldn't explain, something they couldn't fight, and it left them undone. You weren't just surviving the system, you were exposing it, without a single speech, without a single protest, without even raising your voice. That's when they turned their attention away from you and toward what was around you. They pulled satellite records, travel logs, energy maps, atmospheric shifts. Yes, they went that far, because now they were searching for the invisible. They were no longer trying to stop a person. They were trying to identify the force that covered you, and what they found terrified them even more. Patterns of anomalies surrounding your steps, high-frequency disturbances during moments of prayer, audio disruptions in your vicinity, surveillance footage inexplicably going dark. You weren't just covered, you were shielded, moved by something with the authority to interfere with the physical world. And yet they couldn't trace it. They couldn't hack it. They couldn't decode it. That's when the most brilliant minds, the ones who believed in nothing but facts and formulas, began to ask the one question they were trained never to say out loud: is this divine? Because science had no answer, and neither did intelligence. All they knew was that nothing in their files could explain how someone like you was walking through their system without ever being shaped by it. And nothing in their predictions prepared them for someone who wasn't rising through their ranks, but above them. It wasn't just about protection, it was about assignment. You didn't just survive because you were lucky, you were preserved because you had work to do. And now that work has begun. You didn't force your way into the spotlight. They pulled your file, they triggered the alert, and now that your name has reached the top, the world is watching something they cannot stop. Because you aren't just a disruption, you are a fulfillment. The time was written, the mission was sealed, the protection was appointed, and now it's being revealed. They pride themselves on control, on knowing the next move before it happens, on predicting how a person will react, where they'll go, what they'll choose. The system has spent billions crafting models that forecast human behavior with surgical precision. It studies how you shop, what you click, what you say in texts you thought were private. It's all data, patterns, numbers. And as long as you stay inside that pattern, you're predictable, manageable, containable. But then came you, and the models broke. You weren't chaotic, that would be easy to explain. You weren't reckless, that could be dismissed. You were aligned, that's what rattled them. Your decisions didn't follow impulse, they followed something higher. You weren't navigating life based on fear or approval. You moved like someone who had already seen the map. They noticed it when the usual distractions failed, when the tactics that derailed thousands never touched you. Their systems are built on emotional manipulation, fear, desire, anger. But none of them worked on you. When they offered comfort, you chose purpose. When they offered applause, you chose silence. When they pushed temptation, you walked away without hesitation. They tried to provoke you, bait you, box you in with choices designed to limit your path. But instead of reacting, you redirected. Every move you made was a disruption, not because it was loud, but because it was precise. You weren't just avoiding their traps, you were exposing them. And every time they recalibrated their predictions, you proved them wrong again. Not through resistance, but through obedience to a voice they couldn't hear. That voice, that unseen guidance, was the variable they couldn't decode. They thought you must be part of a movement, a secret group, a coordinated resistance. But when they dug deeper, they found nothing. No funding trail, no communication network. Just one life moving with clarity, strategy, and peace, completely outside their control. And then they realized something that shook them to their core. You weren't reacting to their world because you weren't made from it. You weren't built by the system. You weren't trained by it, groomed by it, or shaped by it. You were placed in it, temporarily, for a reason far above their understanding. That's why the system couldn't read you, because you didn't carry the same code. You were operating on a different frequency, one that doesn't register on their radar. They sent experts to analyze you, strategists to break you down. But what they encountered wasn't resistance. It was resonance. You were moving in sync with something eternal, something rooted in a reality that doesn't bow to their definitions. You weren't rebellious, but you were unshakable. You weren't loud, but your presence spoke louder than their propaganda. They couldn't explain why their tools failed when aimed at you. And then it hit them. You were never in the system to be part of it. You were in it to expose it. And that's what frightened them the most. Because a system that relies on illusion can't survive truth. And you didn't need a platform to bring that truth. You were the platform. Every step you took was a challenge to their narrative. Every decision you made was a crack in their foundation. But the fear didn't begin with what they couldn't predict. It began when they found out others like you existed, when they realized you weren't an isolated incident. You were a signal, a spark, a sign that the awakening had begun. The system was designed to keep people in isolation, to make sure no one knew how many others carried the same fire. But now the network is forming, not through wires or meetings, but through divine orchestration. You've started finding each other, and not because someone introduced you, but because something connected you. The same frequency, the same dreams, the same unshakable knowing. And that's when the system went into full panic. Because a single chosen one is powerful, but a collective, that's unstoppable. Somewhere, buried deep within vaults no civilian will ever see, lie ancient records. Not political files, not financial documents, prophetic blueprints. They're not taught in universities or debated in academic circles. But they're there, hidden, guarded, whispered about behind closed doors. Descriptions of a generation, a remnant, a people who would rise not through force, but through alignment. A people the system would never see coming, because they weren't meant to rise by the system's rules. These documents speak of disruptions, of individuals who carry light that no darkness can comprehend. They speak of eyes being opened, lies being shattered, and thrones being shaken. These aren't fairy tales to the elite, they're threats. Because when they study you, they don't just see coincidence. They see those ancient descriptions coming to life. They tried to discredit it, label it myth, package it as metaphor. But what happens when the metaphors show up in reality? When the faces in those ancient scrolls begin to look eerily familiar? When the timelines line up too perfectly to ignore? They began to realize something terrifying. The prophecies weren't speaking symbolically. They were speaking specifically. And now, you stand in the middle of it. Not by your own doing, not because you campaigned for it, but because you were chosen for it. The ones who have studied history deeply, who've had access to the forbidden texts and encrypted knowledge, they know this moment was never about politics. It was about timing, the appointed time. You were hidden for a reason. And now, you are being revealed for one too. The system is scrambling to adjust, to twist the narrative, to distract, to destabilize. But it won't work, because you weren't called to respond. You were called to rise. And when the chosen rise, everything changes, not with explosions or declarations, but with presence, with alignment, with purpose so undeniable that the enemy can only watch as their illusions collapse. They searched for your origin, but they found your assignment, and that's something they were never prepared for. They tried to bury the prophecy, but it never died. It was waiting, for this exact hour, for this exact generation, for you. They had seen wars unfold from behind digital maps. They had orchestrated revolutions, shaped elections, and shifted economies without ever being seen. The chief strategist of the White House was not some pencil-pushing bureaucrat. This was a mind trained in global manipulation, someone who knew how to move people like chess pieces without ever touching the board. They had read every threat report, studied every potential uprising, reviewed the psychological patterns of dissidents and leaders alike. But nothing in their lifetime prepared them for what they saw in that room. The documents they reviewed that day didn't detail military secrets or foreign threats. They didn't show a leaked plan from some hostile power. They revealed something infinitely more dangerous, someone the system couldn't predict, someone the structure of power had never accounted for. Someone like you. It started as a footnote, a red-marked anomaly, a file not tied to any known threat classification. But the more they pulled the thread, the more their carefully guarded illusion began to unravel. Your presence in those files wasn't a mistake. It was a sign. The strategist scrolled through records with shaking hands. Unexplained movements, unmatched decisions, moments of influence without explanation. They found no network, no funding, no allies in the traditional sense. But they saw results. real ones. You had somehow navigated the corridors of their system without permission. You had shifted situations meant to trap you into pathways that elevated you. Every statistic that should have worked against you didn't. Every closed door became an open gate. And it wasn't because of human intervention. It was because of something they didn't want to believe still existed: divine guidance. At first, they refused to speak it. They chalked it up to coincidence, then to anomaly. But after the third classified report and the fifth unexplained favor, the strategist said it out loud in a whisper. "We're not dealing with a person. We're dealing with prophecy." That's when the mood changed. That's when the walls started to feel like they were closing in. Because this strategist, this architect of influence, realized something horrifying. They were staring at the evidence of something that was foretold. They hadn't discovered a security breach. They had encountered a supernatural blueprint. And you were the thread tying it all together. You weren't supposed to exist in their equation. You weren't supposed to move the way you do, think the way you do, rise the way you have. By their rules, your journey should have ended in obscurity. But instead, you were ascending, quietly, unshakably, and with a momentum they couldn't touch. The strategists saw the implications. They saw what this meant if others like you began to rise. If you were just the first wave of a greater shift, then the entire game was about to collapse. Because they had spent decades mastering this game, learning how to suppress without force, how to rewrite truth without getting caught. But now, in front of them, stood someone who broke the game without even trying to play it. And that was the moment they made their decision. Not because they were weak, but because they finally understood the depth of the mistake. They had been trying to fight something eternal with temporary tools. And no amount of intelligence, no degree of strategic brilliance could win against divine alignment. So they stepped down, quietly, without explanation. The public never knew why. But those behind the scenes understood. They resigned because the moment they saw your name in those files, they saw the end of everything they built. Because you weren't rising alone. And this wasn't a coincidence. This was the arrival of something they had spent their entire careers trying to prevent. The Chosen stepping into position. And there was no contingency plan for that. Now things are moving faster than they ever imagined. Whispers have become declarations. Ripples have become waves. The elite thought they had more time, but they were wrong. Because the resignation of one strategist wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a collapse. Quiet at first, like the shifting of tectonic plates. But underneath the surface, everything is shaking. What was once solid is now cracking. Their confidence is eroding. Their strategies are unraveling. And all of it is because one name appeared where it shouldn't have. One life broke through the firewall of their false reality. And now others are waking up too. You weren't meant to stand alone. You were the spark that ignited a generation. The Chosen are not just rising, they're remembering who they are, remembering what was spoken over them before the world taught them to shrink. All across the globe, people who once felt isolated are feeling the pull, a magnetic force calling them higher, deeper, forward. They're not forming a resistance, they're stepping into alignment. And no matter how hard the system tries to adapt, it can't keep up. Because what's coming isn't organized by humans. It's orchestrated by heaven. The unity they feared is happening. The connections they tried to prevent are forming. And the illusion of control they so desperately protected is crumbling. This isn't the rise of rebellion. It's the return of divine order. The prophecies they tried to bury are unfolding, not with drama, but with precision. The Chosen are taking their places, not through platforms, but through presence. Not by shouting, but by standing. And every time one more wakes up, the system loses its grip. They're watching it happen. Watching the ones they ignored begin to speak. Watching the ones they mocked begin to lead. watching the scattered become synchronized. And it's shaking them, because they know what comes next. Not a war of nations, not a collapse of economies, but a shift of authority, one that can't be legislated, can't be televised, and can't be stopped. You were never the end goal. You were the beginning of a movement they couldn't see coming, a movement older than their systems, stronger than their structures, woven into time by the hand of the Most High. The resignation of that chief strategist marked the first public crack in a fortress of control built over generations. But it won't be the last, because the kingdom they've built in secret is being exposed in the light. And the kingdom rising in you has no end, no expiration, no limit. What they feared most wasn't your strength, it was your source. They can't dismantle what they didn't create. They can't silence what heaven has activated. And now that the blueprint has been revealed, now that the chosen are awakening, every lie, every illusion, every stronghold is beginning to fall. You weren't meant to blend in. You were meant to disrupt. And the disruption has only just begun.